This is Rick Crandall, and I'm here with Chris Bonington. And we've got a beautiful setting behind us. It's one of our major 14ers in the Rockies in Colorado, Pyramid Peak behind us. That's my passion. That's what I've been doing at my later years, climbing these mountains. Chris, of course, has climbed just about everything in creation that's above a major height, 8,000 meter peaks, the Himalayas, and several times up on several different routes on Everest. Some being first ascent on very hard routes, the South Face, for example. And I'm wondering what Chris thinks about what's going on right now with 200 or 300 people lined up just below the Hillary Step and towards the summit, stuck. People trying to get down the same rope, people trying to go up. And this is what's happened. It's become a commercial venture. What does that feel like to you, where you were solo on the mountain just with your own team?
I think everything in life changes and develops, and this is exactly the thing that has happened in the Himalayas. And if we go right the way back to the beginning of climbing, I mean, you could argue that we Brits invented climbing in the mid-19th century when wealthy Englishmen went off on the Great Tour, past the Alps, and then thought, oh, it'd be rather fun to go and climb on those. And it really developed from that. And interestingly, it actually developed right from the beginning with guides. And so your English gentlemen then found local people who were either crystal hunters who were going up above the tree line and up above the snow line, or hunters who were hunting the chamois. And so they knew a little bit about the mountains, but they didn't know anything about climbing either. So it was the client and the guide that were discovering it for themselves and were working as a team, very different from what it is today. So that was the start. And then it developed, the clients found, or the more adventurous clients found that being guided up, being second in the rope is not what climbing is all about. Climbing is about making the decisions and being out in front.
Leading
and starting to climb guideless. And a few climbers began to do that, and the establishment said, oh, that's terrible, very dangerous and irresponsible. But they were the people who were breaking trail. So that went on in the Alps, and then of course people started going further afield and went to the Himalayas, and once again it was the British who were in the lead there, simply because we had India and we had our access to the Himalayas. We also had an access to Tibet, because in fact when the Tibetans started getting at all difficult, we sent in a punitive expedition to march to Lhasa to open it up forcibly, and that gave the chance of.
That was about when in time?
This was in basically before the First World War.
All right, so 1910.
So 1910 or so, but it was after the First World War, in the early 1920s, 1921, that the first Everest expedition went in from the north. And in those days, Nepal was a completely independent country, and Britain wanted to keep it that way, but with its special relationship with Nepal. And we were recruiting, basically mercenary Gurkha regiments to serve in the British Army. But they wanted to keep all kind of, civilians and everything out of it. So Nepal was totally closed up to after the First World War. So anyway, so that's developed the way through to set it. And I think going back though to climbing and the way my climbing developed, and I suppose I was lucky that I was born in 1934, I started climbing in 1951. And in 1951, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the actual climbing equipment was very, very similar to what they were using at the beginning of the century.
Which is not much.
Century. Which, yeah, I mean, my first boots were clink-nailed boots. My first jacket was basically a cotton jacket, close woven cotton jacket and so on. Down had come in, but everything was very bulky, of course. But anyway, so the equipment was developed, and firstly you got when I started climbing, I had a couple of slings around my neck, and you actually, when you're lead climbing, you put the sling over a little knoll of rock, or if there's a stone jammed in a crack, you put it on that, and on round that, and you're reliant on that entirely. And of course, these were all hemp as well. So basically, you really did not have to fall off.
But you weren't hurting the mountain. You weren't pounding things into the mountain.
We weren't hurting the mountains, and also in Britain, because I suppose we had these smaller crags, and in actual fact, what started was climbing in the Alps, and then your British climber wanted to get some training, so they started climbing in the English Lake District, Snowdonia, and so on. And therefore, they started from a complete beginning. And one of the things they did was they didn't like pitons. They felt pitons were cheating. And meanwhile, also on the continent, particularly in Eastern Europe, they were beginning to climb as well. And whereas in Britain it was still very much a middle-class sport, on the continent it was much more widely across the classes. And in climbing the Dolomites, you had to use pitons. And so the piton was found there. You hammered your steel spike into a crack, and you were using these. And also, when it got very steep, you'd start actually aid climbing, where you'd actually be climbing with étrier and that.
Jumars.
So that you had within that, well, no, you had Prussic loops. Jumars were, I think, coming in about to the 1960s.
Okay, see, I'm later. I've used it.
So
okay.
there you are. So it's all. But the British trad climbing was that you basically did not. You accepted the rock as it is, and you didn't leave any marks. And to me, that philosophically is a very, very strong part of what climbing should be all about. So anyway, so we come now into the post-war period, and the Himalayan climbing was starting as well. And initially, all the first ascents of the big peaks were done with Sherpas, using, because of the height and the distance and the altitude, a series of camps. So it was what you described as siege-style climbing.
Yeah.
And there was still, though, in the early 1950s, there were one or two people who were doing a more adventurous kind of climbing as well. It was Eric Shipton, who was a brilliant kind of pioneer of exploratory climbing. And when it came to the really big mountains, though, like Everest, you did seem to need to use those kind of techniques.
Because you needed acclimatization, but it
Well,
also
not
made
so
a
much
supply
that.
chain
Well,
problem.
all your gear was quite heavy.
Yeah.
And this is the other thing, that we're constantly evolving gear. We're already in our climbing, even in our kind of trad climbing systems, we evolved from basically looping a bit of rope over a spike of rock, and then someone thought, well, if you had in fact used ordinary nuts of metal nuts, and you could have a little string of them, so you had about 5 different sizes on a short loop, and you could jam one of them in. Who thought of that, I don't know, but I started doing that about 1963. Then, of course, someone said, well, you could shape them and have specialist ones, like a wedge. And then they got more and more, and then you got the camming devices coming out, which are today's friends, and that was once again a major invention, because it meant that you then, rather than being dependent on finding the right size nut to fit a wide crack, you could have a camming device. You could just put it in and tie off onto it. And so climbing techniques were improving the whole time, and gear and equipment was improving the whole time. From, in fact, basically just a cotton jacket, a Ventile jacket was very fine woven, actually did keep out the rain for a long time, and it did breathe. And then polyurethane was invented or brought in, which actually was totally waterproof, but the only trouble is you sweated so much inside it that you were just as wet as afterwards. And then of course Gore-Tex arrived,
right.
And then all the other things, and all of these things, and also the greater knowledge about food and getting that lighter. And this was going to enable the climber to actually not make it well, it made it easier, but that meant him to stretch the limit, so he could climb harder and harder. And of course, all forms of human development is that each generation does want to strike new bounds, do new things, and this is how the climbing development has come to the present day.